Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Sophia Greskin, and on behalf of the Institute on Inequalities and Global Health, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's dialogue, Until We Are All Equal, Imagining Equal Power. And to our students, faculty, staff, and the audience, welcome also to the start of another semester. We're so looking forward to an academic year that's filled with conversations that try to push boundaries and that can help us to think collectively, just not about what is, but what can and what should be. Now, one thing I have to say is that for us at IIGH, this is a special year. For all who don't know, this is our 5th anniversary, and we see it as a really important marker. I mean, 5 years gives us the ability to start to reflect on how far we've come as an institute, but more importantly, all that we've all lived through these last few years. And the thing is that despite significant progress in recognizing health inequalities, in many ways, I guess, due to the pandemic, we all know actually addressing health inequalities is not happening at all in the ways we'd all hoped for. And in fact, global disparities haven't just continued to exist, they've deepened. And that's been accompanied, not surprisingly, by increasing setbacks in human rights protections, not just here in the US, but around the world. So because of all of this, we felt we should frame our 5th anniversary series under the banner Until We Are All Equal. So we've got 3 virtual events, 1 in-person event, and they're all intended to address what we see as key issues for all of those of us concerned with the state of the world and with trying to play a positive role going forward. There are vexing issues around power, around partnerships, and around human rights that we really have to get our heads around if we're going to be able to build momentum and make positive change in this moment. So today's event, moderated by IIGH Director of Policy Engagement, Jonathan Cohen, is about power. And Jonathan is joined by an incredible group of global health leaders, and if I'm honest, long-term friends and colleagues, but all true visionaries and all with an immense amount to share. And with that, I want to pass it over to Jonathan, who's going to introduce our panelists and moderate the event. But for those of you who don't know Jonathan and all of his amazing work, in addition to being Director of Policy Engagement with us and clinical professor here at the Keck School of Medicine, I think people know his wonderful work at the intersection of health and human rights, all the important things he did before joining us, including his roles at OSF. But I wanted to point out 2 current things that are very relevant here. He's leading significant work now on the health and rights dimensions of global aging, and he represents both IIGH and the Keck School of Medicine on USC's new Capitol campus in Washington, D.C. So clearly very attuned to issues of power in global health. I'm super excited about this. And with Jonathan, can I send it over to you? And thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sophia, and greetings, everyone, from the USC Capitol campus in Washington, D.C., a fitting place to discuss issues of power in global health, as you pointed out. Some of the questions that we will be exploring with our extraordinary panelists over the next hour are things like how in the field of global health do we shape global governance so that decision-making is not driven exclusively by those with the most power and resources? What are the possibilities in our field for achieving genuine solidarity between nations and communities with vastly different access to resources and decision-making? What theories and practices of power currently guide the field of global health, and what theories and practices of power ought to guide the field of global health? How can we recognize and how can we disrupt power structures in order to bring equity to the forefront of actions impacting health and well-being? Clearly a set of questions that we could occupy much more than an hour discussing, but we really are so fortunate to have this time with the 3 panelists that I have the privilege of introducing to you now. Our 3 panelists, I'll introduce them all now. We'll go into Q&A. I want to encourage you to add your questions to the chat at any moment. Feel free to type in a question, to type in a comment, and we will weave those questions into our discussion. This is going to be a conversation. not a set of formal presentations. And let me just introduce who we're going to be speaking with today. In no particular order, Lois Pace is the person responsible for advancing the United States government's international health agenda through multilateral and bilateral forums. She reports directly to the US Secretary of Health and Human Services and is the HHS Office of Global Affairs lead on setting priorities and policies that promote American public health agencies and interests worldwide. Assistant Secretary Pace oversees our government's engagement with foreign governments and international institutions on global health, as well as policy-making bodies as diverse as the G7, the G20, the UN General Assembly, and the World Health Assembly. She joined the US government as Assistant Secretary for Global Affairs at HHS, following an incredibly distinguished career in global health, including roles as President and Executive Director of the Global Health Council. She was a member of the Biden-Harris Transition COVID-19 Advisory Board, and before that spent over a decade working with community-based organizations and grassroots leaders across Africa and Asia on campaigns calling for person-centered access to health. Welcome, Assistant Secretary Pace. Also joining us today is Rajat Khosla, the Partnership for Maternal, Newborn, and Child Health Executive Director, who took that post in May of 2024. Congratulations and welcome to your new post, Rajat. Rajat comes to the partnership from the International Institute on Global Health at UN University, where he also acted as director. He works on women, children, and adolescent health through the intersections of research, policy, and practice. Over more than 2 decades, he has focused on global health and inequalities, sexual and reproductive health and rights, gender equality, and health equity. He has worked previously with the World Health Organization and the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, as well as in a wide variety of research and policy roles within civil society organizations and think tanks. Welcome, Rajat. And last but not least, we are joined today by Solange Baptiste. Solange is the Executive Director of ITPC Global, where she leads a global community of activists and allies in their mission for health and social justice through robust community engagement to drive equality in health. With a focus on HIV as an entry point to the broader human right to health, Solange's work encompasses ensuring access and availability to quality treatment for all, making medicines affordable, and building community systems for a joint health effort. She is also a member of the steering committee of the Global Public Investment Network, or GPIN, which addresses development financing for global public goods. And for over 18 years, Solange has worked to ensure that the voice of affected communities influences the decisions and policies that affect their lives. She's joining us from Johannesburg today and is a native of Trinidad and Tobago. Warm welcome to you, Solange. So I am going to kick us off. We're going to have a good time with this topic. And I'm going to kick it off with a question for all of you, as is no doubt evident from those biographies. You three have seen it all. You've seen it all in the field of global health. And looking back, and Assistant Secretary Pace, we're going to start with you. Looking back on the range of positions that you've held in the field, and not asking you to speak out of school or name any names, tell us something that you have directly witnessed that stands out for you as an unforgettable example of unequal power dynamics in our field. And if you wish, please also share something that stands out as a prime example of power and decision-making being truly shared.
Yeah. Well, Well, thanks for that. Hi, everyone, and happy anniversary to my friends at USC. It's really a great milestone, and it's great to have you in this game with us. I wouldn't I wouldn't dare say that I have seen it all in global health. I hope there's much more to see and many more ways that we will evolve, including in the direction we're talking about today. But I will start with the end of your question first, which is what I've seen work. I mean, what I've seen work um, actually is probably like the pieces that aren't as visible. And frankly, they're not as visible to me because it's not my business to be in those networks and communities that are being that are really getting the work done in the most effective way. I think a lot about sort of the decentralized models of, say, the Global Fund for Women, and sorry, you did say not to name names, but as examples. Or even chapters of women in global health. And, there are a number of models that really say, even if they're imperfect, right, at a global level, or, sort of like at HQ, I think the benefit of using this network or node model and really not just sharing power, but recognizing power and sort of enabling people to step fully into that power is what I've seen work well, especially if, things come crashing down. Otherwise, like the entire enterprise doesn't need to suffer as a result. Now, I think the problem I've seen with that is when funding doesn't keep up. I think that donors in large part still follow a very traditional model, a top-down model that doesn't recognize the need to sort of have a more dispersed approach. And I'm curious to hear if other people have examples of when and how that's working, right? Because I think what I've also seen is those networks not really survive in a way that ideally they could. Now into the tougher examples. I don't really have a good example in which I wouldn't be able to name names, but I will tell you that what I have seen in leadership across global health has been still a difficult pill to swallow. We have plenty of conversations about who's in charge and the profiles of people in charge. But I think what we don't talk enough about is twofold. One is the fact that slates to even consider who's in charge are still not where they need to be in terms of, just who comes through the pipeline and ends up in front of boards or otherwise as kind of second, third finalist. I think also what I've seen is, the benefit of the doubt is still not granted to those, quote, diverse applicants or candidates or, people who ultimately get that position. What do I mean? I mean that someone who perhaps has never worked in this space, not just globally, but even in the health sector, can come up with a big, bold idea that's welcomed by a board if that person happens to speak with an English or American accent, perhaps comes from finance or has other political connections, right? In a way that is not appreciated or accepted for someone else who doesn't come with that profile. And I have been on boards or otherwise in rooms where I've seen the same idea come from those different types of leaders, and people question the risk a leader is taking if they don't fit a certain profile, rather than, with someone else. I'm like, well, isn't that still risky? But because of who's delivering it and who's presenting it, it feels safer.
Thank you. Thank you. So grateful to you for putting so many of the important issues on the table at the very top. Solange, I actually want to go to you next, in part because Assistant Secretary Pace has put the question of decentralized networks and power sharing in communities on the table, which is, of course, an issue very close to your heart. And of course, the question of whether the funding environment supports models of shared power. So please feel free to comment on that if you wish, or of course, on the question of who's in the leadership, and just to share your own recollections of when you have seen power shared and not shared in global health. Over to you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so if I were to pick up where Lois left off. It's really, well, first of all, congratulations and thanks for having me. Sorry, I got excited about the question. Look, I think the other questions that I kind of thought about when we were preparing were easier. This question actually made me think quite a lot about power dynamics. And obviously then I thought about my children and I was like, I'm going to let my son help me with this cake. But good Lord, he is not measuring accurately. He doesn't know what he's doing. And I'm certainly not sharing the power that I have as a parent. And I'm like, come on, Solange, you can't use a parent-child example as public health. But I have seen some things play out in front of my eyes, and it makes me wonder if I'm in reality or not. So I think there are, as you said, Jonathan, many different perhaps levels in which we could think about the question, like, the power dynamics, let's say, of donors and grantees, power dynamics among countries or groups of countries and other countries, power dynamics with women or minority groups. And, some of the ways that we have worked around that, you would see, I'll have the idea, not me necessarily, but the group or person that has the idea will need to have it said by somebody else so that it's taken seriously and so that that thing can have some root. I mean, we all find ways to work around it, but I think this session, for example, the session planning is an example of that. So it's not that there are, PhDs and important people that get to speak in the panel and then you get 5 minutes for a community perspective, because that's good to have, because it makes your stuff participatory. So that's, as you said, an example. It doesn't have to be a big thing. It doesn't have to be like pooled funding in which a particular country is also stepping up to give funding, which I think is an example that has happened recently with pandemic funds. But I think about just like writing journal articles in these publications, and often it's written by the tenured professor or the academic researcher who's done something from a university. And then at the end, they say, oh yes, we need a brown person on this list of authors. Let's go get this stuff validated and add them as an author at the last minute. But I've seen that work the opposite way, where you actually have involved that particular person from the beginning in the design of the paper and the writing of the paper, and then they get to share in the authorship as well. So it's just, I think, the difference between, let's make something together and truly co-create versus, just the person in power saying, you should just be grateful I gave you a part of it. And I go back then to my son saying, like, just put the sprinkles on, because that's all I can trust you with. But yeah, those are some of the thoughts that come to mind. Thanks.
I must applaud our first two speakers for being so hard-hitting and so diplomatic at the same time. These are my words, not yours, but you've put the issue of tokenism straight on the table. Thank you. You have put the issue of gendered double standards on the table. Thank you. Rajat Khosla, with those opening salvos in mind, what can you share with us, having seen so much about the good, the bad, and the ugly of power relations in global health?
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm certainly not going to be diplomatic, if I may, in what I would say, but I think the question did make me ponder, as I highlighted by both Lois and Solange as well. And without wanting to sound cynical or overly cynical, I should say, at this stage, it was very hard to find what does not represent unequal power relationships in global health today. We have come out of COVID-19, and in the context that we are living in, I think it is very startling, to say the least, in the sense of from decision-making to who's on the table to how conversations are shaped, from funding to programmatic agendas in multilateral organizations and elsewhere as well. But I do have to say that one issue that has stood out for me repeatedly, in which I think the way power manifests itself is rather unique, and in a way, in its most brazen form, if I may say so, is when we look at the issues around bodily autonomy and sexual and reproductive health and rights, and particularly abortion. And I don't think there is an issue that stands out where we see the nakedness in which power manifests itself, whether it is global policy conversations or it is in the sense of how national policy decisions are made. And for me, one such incident that did stand out was, and this is when I was working at Amnesty International, and the incident in Ireland, where as we know, there was a women dentist who was in need of safe abortion, and because of legislation in Ireland at the time, she was denied abortion and she died as a consequence. And here is, a educated, well-placed, has positionality in society individual, but could not access basic health care to save her life. And I don't think anything in my imagination comes to mind that manifests that complete disconnect between the people who have power and control the agendas when it comes to global health and people who have to live with those consequences in global health. So that was the way I have looked at and understood power in its different manifestations, but the one that relationship did stand out for me. But the other, and at the same time, the one that did lift my spirits up was the green wave in Latin America, where it did, present to us a very clear statement that power is not given. Nobody wants to give up power. Power has to be taken, and people marching on the streets can effect change. And I think that was, for me, a game-changing moment, not only for people living in Latin America, for the change that was effective, but an inspiration around the world on how, in sometimes most difficult of circumstances, power can shift and change can happen in situations where we would have never imagined in those countries that we could have, changes in legislation and women are able to access safe abortion care services. So maybe I'll leave it there. Happy to unpack much of it as we move along.
Definitely. And I want to invite, I'm going to come back to each panelist for a follow-up question, and definitely want to invite you to continue unpacking the specific issues of sexual and reproductive health and rights and abortion. I want to thank one of our audience members, Chris Collins, who's put out an excellent question in the Q&A, and invite Assistant Secretary Pace, if you would, to share a little bit about the back and forth that came out of that question. Chris Collins, who of course is the president of Friends of the Global Fight, who has played a key leadership role in preserving and enlarging the bipartisan funding consensus for the global AIDS response out of the US government and PEPFAR, would like to know, and I'm going to assume knows influential people in the US Congress who want to know what some examples are of US supported programs that actually promote equity in decision-making, and how we can incentivize genuine power sharing in our US global health investments. Lois Pace, what were some of the thoughts you had on that?
Yeah, I really appreciated Chris's question, and I see Solange is typing an answer too, so would love to hear from others here. The something I said to Chris is, look, the bones are there in some cases. I think that civil society in particular, shout out to fellow advocates who, have really held donors and institutions' feet to the fire when it comes to inclusion. Let alone diversity and accessibility and other really important priorities for our space and others. And I think we continue to hear from those very civil society advocates that it doesn't always work the way that we hope. And I think it's an uncomfortable conversation, not only to have with those institutions, but to frankly have with the very people you mentioned, Jonathan, people on the Hill, right? People in Congress, in our case, who, I got to be honest, don't seem as interested in that being effective. I think, folks are just happy to know that there is a seat for civil society at the table. Sorry, I'm being very real right now. I think people are happy to know that civil society has a seat or a chair and has a voice, if not a vote. But I don't think they're as concerned as they need to be. That does not always shake out the way that it should when the rubber hits the road. Why does that matter? It matters because it directly affects how effective we actually can be in the mandate that some of these institutions have. Whether we're talking about PEPFAR or Global Fund, for example, which I know Chris pays a lot of attention to, we're not going to get anywhere if we don't have people around the table who will help us really reach these goals, particularly in communities that they represent or that they have the best inroads into, especially when it comes to the stuff Rajat's flagging, right? The entire crisis around sexual and reproductive health and rights that we continue to face globally. This is a real challenge, and we have to, whether we're talking about reproductive health, whether we're talking and women's reproductive rights and access to care, whether we're talking about LGBTQI plus communities and their safety and how they're full on targeted with recent legislation, including in our country, right? We need to be serious about what these communities are telling us, what they're bringing to the table, how they're challenging the work and the way that resources are directed. Because and frankly, we have to listen, right? I just think that we hear them, we nod our heads, and then we don't take the action that's required. And it's one of the reasons why I think it's important to acknowledge the structure exists, but we still have to make some serious improvements to that. Otherwise, I think plenty of advocates have also said, why bother? Like you said, Jonathan, don't just check a box by having me here.
Thanks so much, Solange. Let's indeed go to you. You've pointed out in the chat that Global Fund, governance at the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria is an example of shared power. You see the developing country community delegations going toe to toe with the donors, and obviously great to know that every time the U.S. Contributes to replenishing the Global Fund, that's an investment in as good a model as shared governance, perhaps, as we've got. But what about like the PEPFAR process? Solange, if I could put you on the spot a bit, you've seen that up close. Care to comment on shared power in developing PEPFAR programs?
Yeah, do I care to comment? Yeah, I think, look, the governance aspects of this, and I'm going to come at this from a scenic route, but I've just come from many conversations around climate and health and climate window, the impact of climate on health. And I think despite agreeing fully with what has been said before, the health sector, HIV in particular, and even though there are many failings, is way advanced compared to, for example, where the communities who are affected by climate events are in accessing funding, in being able to be part of the governance from a climate perspective. And so there's a lot of lessons and way forward that HIV and health has charted. And I just wanted to make sure we put that out there. Because it's extremely difficult for, there are questions that were coming from communities affected by climate events and looking at locally led adaptation and community-based adaptations from a climate perspective, we're all like light years behind, like, how do we get the money? And we are here talking about how to better influence when we are in the CCM or we're in the PEPFAR country operational planning meetings. So I just wanted to kind of give us a little bit of perspective. But in terms of the PEPFAR process, look, I think it really depends on the country and the political context at that time. I have seen things go really well in specific country operational planning rooms. I'm not sure if everybody is aware of what we're talking about, but there are rooms where there are specific countries and you talk through what are the priorities and you look at what the funding and issues can be. I have seen things go really well. depending on the ability of those that have power in the room to ensure that those voices are there. And then how things play out at a country level, again, depends on what administration is in place. So I think it can go either way. In terms of a process, there is space for community to be able to speak, and there have been many instruments that communities themselves have come up with and have been funded indirectly, perhaps by the US government, but other spaces as well, other donors as well, to be able to use accountability mechanisms to show data that says this is what's happening. You're saying one thing, but we're experiencing something completely different. So I think the PEPFAR process, given the fact that it's a bilateral sort of mechanism, it is one that has quite a bit of built-in accountability in it, given that it is a bilateral top-down funding. I could, talk more about things that could be improved, but I think it's important for us to keep a balanced perspective. This is not a multilateral discussion. Yeah, thanks.
No, thanks, Solange. And I actually want to stay with you. I had a follow-up question prepared to each of you, and while you have the floor, I want to start with yours, because I do suspect that the success of any shared governance model, whether it's PEPFAR or the Global Fund or climate change, depends on something that we sometimes refer to as community power, right? And communities having power. And indeed, in our field, it has been said that there will never be universal access to healthcare without community power, without communities claiming their human right to health. And I wanted to ask you, as someone who has worked to build community power over so many years, what does that take? What does it take to build sustainable community power? And also, what have the HIV pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and other challenges taught you about both the opportunities and the limitations of building community power for universal access to healthcare?
Thanks for that question. Not a small question, a very weighty question. So in terms of like being able to build community power, you can't, okay, I would start with the fact that you cannot build community power without relevant information. So whether you want to call that awareness, information, education, knowledge, however you want to package it, even messaging, things you cannot advocate, you cannot influence, you cannot do anything unless you actually know what you're talking about, meaning the standards of care, the policies, what should be, what does the normative guidance say, what does your country policy say, and what is actually happening? Because then you can see where the gap is between like reality versus policy, law, or whatever the guidance should be from a normative space. So communities that have closer access to relevant, au courant information, what's going on with monkeypox, what's going on right now, right? You can see the communities that were able to influence change during COVID were the ones who understood what was going on with COVID as much as possible. So getting really relevant information to communities in a way that they understand it. So let's deal with misinformation, disinformation, fake news. Let's speak proper messaging that gets to communities. So not comorbidities, but really like, do you have sugar? Do you have high blood pressure? Like, don't use hypertension. Like in terms of what communities at the grassroots level can actually latch onto and can speak to and spread, that is good information. And then in terms of what they should be accessing, vaccines, whatever the information is. So power comes from that knowledge, that knowledge sharing. So I remember during COVID, it was a lot of, the WHO, UN agencies would actually ask communities, can you please tell us what's going on the ground? Because it was so new and it was so raw that nobody really knew what was happening. So communities were, especially from the HIV infrastructure, were very instrumental in that part. And then the other piece of it, and I don't know if it's necessarily some specific kind of architecture, but the ability to have a platform to organize and then influence. So communities need to be able to coordinate, advocate, act upon the information that they're finding. So when you monitor and you see that there is a gap, now what are you going to do? We need to actually band together. And that's where the power is built. So now we're coming together and we're all going to say one thing. So it's not an anecdotal, qualitative quote that is put into some very analytical report, but it's actually these communities are experiencing this, and that has, it's a systems problem, it's a consistent problem, it's a persistent problem, and there's data evidence to back that up, and then there is advocacy that can happen. And then the ability to influence and shape the policies and the strategies, right? We've seen that if this is disconnected from the real world challenges, then we won't be able to make any progress. So communities during COVID that, for example, were not included in the response saw slower access to those critical interventions. So I think it's really important that we must ensure that community representatives are not only consulted, but they're also decision makers. I think in terms of community power, the last thing I'd say here is to make sure that we don't think of communities as the extractive place that we go to get the information, and that's all communities are useful for, but they can bring solutions to the table. So there were so many innovations in the COVID space in terms of basic things like hand washing and the ability to know what to do when you got this vaccine and spreading good information, correct and accurate information. That kind of innovation comes from communities, and there are solutions that come from there in terms of distribution of medicines. You could think about that. Now we're distributing medicine under a tree. Before we were like, no, you must go to the pharmacist, you must have a PhD, and you can only get one pill at a time. We have moved so far beyond that in terms of our mechanisms for delivery, but that's all because of community power. And even building the Global Fund and PEPFAR, that's because of communities coming together. We tend to rewrite history and say, no, these things exist, and we are just begging bowls at the center, at the end. But I think it's important to think about that. I don't know if I answered the question at this point. I'm just
more than thank you so much for that, Solange. And I want to shift from talking about building community power to changing institutional conduct. And Rajat, I'm going to come to you on that. But before I do, Assistant Secretary Pace or Rajat, do either of you want to get in a comment about building community power before we start talking about institutional behavior?
I would love to hear more from Rajat, honestly. Although I have to give Solange the biggest shout out, because I mean, people who are speaking rarely give themselves enough credit for the work that they're doing. So I acknowledge that. And, I actually, when I heard your question, Jonathan, I was really thinking about some recent interactions I had with community stakeholders who were just doing the work. And to her point of, how this is about other people bringing solutions to the table. I mean, one of the last times I was in Brazil, I met a gentleman who had been working with our CDC in the favelas during COVID. And he saw that they were doing like surveillance in his neighborhood and just said, I want to do something to help my community if that's what we're doing. He learned English playing video games and is now, this like digital health warrior for the CDC in Rio, which is huge, Similarly, I met this woman last week when I was in Peru or last month, and she has this entire network where she's really encouraging people to think about vaccinations as rights. And at a time when there's, so much supposed resistance to innovations, and, some of it is founded, obviously. I come from a community that has a really tough history with medical innovations, but there's also just a lot of misinformation about what we deserve, what we can access, what we should have. And the way that they've done it in Voces in Latin America has really just empowered folks and allowed them to use their voices to demand these things for themselves. And so I've just really appreciated those very specific, tangible interactions I've had with people, and really just thought about ways to bring that home even in the role that I have now.
Thank you so much for lifting up those experiences and bringing them into this space. We could talk about building community power for this entire session. Rajat, as I said, I do want to move to you and talk a bit about changing institutional norms and institutional conduct. And I'm asking you this because you've worked for so many different types of institutions. You worked for NGOs, you've worked for universities, you've worked for multiple United Nations agencies. You must have some pretty specific ideas about ways that these institutions should address unequal power dynamics in their work and mission, and concrete steps that they can take to disrupt the status quo of unequal power relations in our field.
Thanks, Jonathan. Experience indeed, but solutions probably not, because I particularly agree with the comment that Carmen has in the chat, that much of this remains a work in progress. And then I think we have all tested different ideas, modalities, and indeed, as she puts it, there is an inherent contradiction at times with which we are working with and what we are trying to confront in these conversations. And I do have to say, and completely agree with everything that both Solange and Lois just said, because I do think to shift institutional power, you need to have the community power behind it. And where I have seen change sustain itself and actually result in a meaningful change is not that when it was brought, from top down to shift institutional power, when it came from communities demanding a change in power, whether it is within the context of the organization that I worked with or I'm working again in right now, or any other organizations, whether it is civil society organizations, INGOs, or otherwise. It is when we had social movements demanding change is when these institutions changed and delivered on a more sustainable agenda. So for me, institutional change and for people in the leadership roles wanting to effect change, I think the first question is why are we doing it? Is it trying to serve a tokenistic sense of us ticking a box that we are, now addressing issues of coloniality, of racism, of equity, or is this something more inherent that we would like to shift? And I think that's not just be, stating it as a provocation, but I think the problem we often have is that we do not start by questioning our own positionality and power that we have in these conversations. What is it that we want to change? Because we are all on this conversation heavily embedded in power structures ourselves. And I think the change to start and effect in an institutional context, it has to start by questioning why and our own power and privilege that we would need to start the questioning with. The second is what I found very interesting is a level of intentionality that must be embedded into the process on what we are trying to do. Because, Lois, to steal your metaphor, it's that these are very uncomfortable conversations and very dismantling at a level for everything that we are trying to talk about. And one does not quite know what would it look like at the other end. We might have an idea or perception, but one has to be ready to have those uncomfortable conversations and to disrupt it for ourselves and for the institution that we are so, wanting to shift the power within. And that requires, not just to use, jargon, but that does require a conversation about values. That does require a conversation about structures, about privileges. And then, how do we deal with it? And something that does not happen quite automatically is the creation of that space to have the dialogue about what is it we are trying to do. I've worked in the context of a think tank, I've with civil society, the UN and elsewhere. One can say, that this is a safe space, a cone of silence, but what does that mean? Because, just the fact that we are having a conversation about this means that there is a level of unease that is about to set in and how we're going to deal with it. And one doesn't quite factor those issues because these are emotive issues, to talk about racism, to talk about coloniality and why, my accent is being, being made light of, and why am I asked to repeat every sentence that I said, where it is particularly clear what I said to everybody in the room. It's not easy to talk about these things, and we need to create that sense of togetherness to come with it. And then the final piece I do want to say, and I think for people leading these processes need to be accountable for these processes as well. Institutional change and shifting power does not happen in a vacuum, and that might mean you need to leave yourself. You need to shift the structure that you are representing, whether it is that as a head of an institution or department or elsewhere. And you need to be ready to take that if you are serious about doing that. And that's the bitter end of the conversation, that it's not easy, but I think that's the space we are in, because the global structures that we are talking about, or the world that we are living in today, is expecting no less. So I think we need to get into this space by challenging ourselves first, and then the institutions that we represent.
Raja, thank you. You alluded to Carmen Barroso's question in the chat, so I want to give you an opportunity to speak to it directly if you wish, or you can just say you feel you have already. But if I can paraphrase, it feels to me that what Carmen Barroso is asking is, how can we expect a powerful global health institution, whether it's a donor or a bilateral or a UN agency, how can we expect them to reshape power relationships with their partners if they can't even interrogate the way power works in their own organizations? Do you have thoughts about that alleged contradiction?
No, absolutely, and in a way, that's what I was getting to, Jonathan, is Carmen's point about the inherent contradictions that we are trying to shift power, but not, questioning our own power and internal structures and processes. And just to reconnect, and this goes back to the point that Solange and Lois were making previously in relation to community power, and this is where, for me, when that shifts is when the community power is behind it and asking for a change, and whether then it is about a foundational structure that we are talking about, or or a government donor relationships that we are trying to investigate. I think when we do have social movements demanding change, we do think the process looks very different.
Thank you. Great. And I want to acknowledge we have some really outstanding questions in the chat, which I know our speakers have access to. So invite you to weave in responses, and I'll uplift those questions to the best of my ability in the time that we have. Assistant Secretary Pace, I want to come back to you and invite you to widen the lens, if you will. I mean, we've talked about building community power, we've talked about changing institutional norms, but taking a step back, and at the risk of getting a bit philosophical, I'm curious to know, what is your philosophy of power? What concept of power do you bring to your job? Because there are so many different ways of thinking about it.
Yeah, I feel like Solange was getting at this earlier, where, power is biology, power is background, power is birthplace, certainly. And I mean, my philosophy is based on who I am and what I've experienced first and foremost. And obviously what I've seen or heard from others is critical to them. Even this conversation is influencing how I try and show up in spaces. But the reality is I was really reflecting before I came into this conversation of how deep I wanted to go. But the reality is I still code switch, or I still feel the need to code switch, I should say. And I don't, just for people who don't use this term often, it's something that we talk about here in the US, particularly for Black populations, but I think others as well, who have learned throughout their lives to be one way in one setting and another way in others, depending on how you show up. It's something that our parents and our grandparents teach us, frankly. Like culturally, you're expected to not be so fill in the blank when you're at work or, when you're at school. And I found myself really feeling like I could be more comfortable, honestly, the older I got and the farther I've gone in my career, until I came to realize that, oh, wait, the way that folks are still responding to me, Assistant Secretary so-and-so, right, with these flags behind me and, like with all the power and influence that supposedly brings. And believe me, I do have privilege that I recognize, probably some privilege I still don't and need to. And yet, I, you know, I still also have some disadvantages when it comes to how I show up in spaces and how I'm received. And I will also say that it is not actually when I leave this country. I actually can be my full self or more of myself, I think, um, outside of the States. And I have really found it refreshing that, I'm received as I am, because people just assume, well, you have this job, surely what you say holds water. So the challenges I face, I find are more within the borders of my home country. So I'll let people sit with that, right? And what that means to, be someone in my position with my background. Again, I haven't seen all there is to see. I don't know all there is to know, but I find myself needing to explain myself far too often. I find myself hearing someone come with the same idea or solution and be received differently. And so, my real philosophy on power is to never discount the power I hold, certainly, and that's a work in progress, but frankly, never discount the power we all hold, right? We all hold power, and shame on us if we need it to show up in a certain way to believe it exists. So people talk about messengers. I think Solange talked about like how we all try to work around and, make sure that we're leveraging other people's power sometimes for ourselves. But my goal often, even in this job, is to ensure that I'm shining a light on other people's power, and I'm recognizing that, and I'm forcing other people around me to see that no matter how someone is showing up, they have something to say, they have something to offer and contribute. They have the change we wish to see. They know where we need to go.
Wow, you talk about power in a way that I think many of us talk about rights, which is that it's inherent, right? It's not bestowed. It's inherent. It's there to be recognized, but not to be given or taken in a way, and perhaps kind of inalienable in that sense. And it does remind me of a lot of the ways, Solange, you were talking about community power, which is so inherent in communities. Do you or do you, Rajat, have thoughts on that articulation of power?
Maybe I could jump in. Yeah, well, not empathize, what's the word I'm looking for? I feel what you're saying. I fully get that. And I think as I reflect on my own trajectory, you end up in a space where it's funny that you use the term code switch. I was listening to a friend of mine who has she's from Trinidad, and she's written books. Now she's an author. She used to be a lawyer. And I'm saying this because it's relevant context, because she was all about the Queen's English. And, we're in Trinidad, we're a British colony, and she's written books now that are in the Trinidadian vernacular, and tried to put a spotlight on that, and didn't make any, excuses for it. And the question was, what is proper English in the Caribbean diaspora, and how does one speak to get respect? And we talked about our age group having this sort of the Queen's English, because back then it was the Queen, and the vernacular, and being able to shift between, depending on who you're speaking to, in order to leverage what you needed to leverage. So it's interesting that you brought that up. But I think as I get older and get more experience, I am just more who I am. And that's from an individual perspective. And I think this, you just are who you are. Your character is what counts. And I think it's the same thing for communities, in that if they can see their own inherent value, as opposed to we are the victim of the system, which is why we try, with ITPC and all the work that we do from this sector, to make sure that communities get the space to shine. It's sort of like, like gold that is hidden in rock, and you need to just literally expose it. I don't need to do anything. I don't need to leverage and harness. I just need you to have your own space and do your own thing. And so I do think that community data, the meaningful, influential spaces where communities can bring solutions to the table, all those things are really important. But no matter how much I speak about building community power, it's not sustainable unless it is supported in a very practical way. So I could talk about shining lights on rocks all I like, but at the end of the day, we need to support communities to be able to really fully see the potential of all that they can bring to the table. And I think it goes to Rajat's point of, values. And it's not just about values, right? But it's about, your values and what you value. Because if you look at what did President Biden say? Something about, it's a total hodgepodge of what he said, but he pretty much said, I can show you what you value by looking at your budget. I don't need you to tell me what you value. Just show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value. And I think if many of us use that lens to think about where we hold community expertise, we would be a telling story.
Thank you. This hour has flown by. I want to give each of you a chance to conclude by suggesting an action that you'd like to see any segment of this audience take to work towards a vision of shared power in our field. Before I do, and I'm going to start with you, Raja, and then we will go back to Solange, and then Assistant Secretary Pace, you'll conclude for us. I do want to acknowledge and invite you to speak to any of these fantastic questions that have come up in the chat about how Indigenous communities can be involved in power sharing, about addressing issues of sovereign debt and unequal power between nations, questions of succession. Lois, there's a question that's just come in for you at the end. But in that order that I mentioned, and in just under a minute each, if you can suggest an action to conclude us today, please.
I'll come to the action in 10 seconds, Jonathan, but just wanted to add something to the previous set of remarks that was made. And I think in reflecting on what you said, Lois, I think the mistake that we often make is that we understand power and conversations about power in a very linear way. And as everything that you were saying is a wonderful manifestation of how power plays with other forms of discrimination, of denial, of prejudice, and increasingly as we see that intersectionality is important, not just in terms of linking different paradigms together, but if you even see how racial power meets in terms of issues around gender inequality and what does that mean and how does that result, it's very startling to say the least. Jonathan, in terms of one action, it's hard to say. And it does bring the conversation down to silver bullets, which I'll not try to do, but maybe I'll end with a bit of a sloganeering and say, question everything. And I think that's what is our responsibility.
Very powerful. Thank you. Thank you for everything today, Solange.
Yeah, I think given time, I'll just respond to your specific question now. I think I would challenge everyone to question themselves whether, am I using my platform to ensure that communities are heard and valued? And if not, maybe you should do something about it. Yep, thanks.
Wonderful.
That's good to model. I think I'll try to say, make space more than you take space. And really, I think for those responsible or having any influence around kind of whose power is getting wielded, know that what we're all talking about is less, you know, the president also talks about having a leadership, having a government that looks like America, and that's great. I think what is also behind what he's saying that a lot of people have missed is that having people who look like America also are bringing ideas to the table that represent more Americans, right? And so the way that I show up, or my Latinx boss shows up, or, Ambassador Nkengasong shows up, that's going to be very different because of our life experiences, because of the lens that we use. And I think people are often surprised at how effective in diplomacy all those people I named are. And it's not just because we look different, it's because of how we try and show up and how that resonates with people we're in front of. So those are my parting words, if you will. But I want to thank the audience for being so engaged too, and for pushing us to keep it real here today.
Thank you all so much. And what a note to end on. It's how you wield power. And we are so grateful for it. And there is power in asking, power in holding back, power in not knowing. We are so indebted and grateful to all of you. Thank you so much. Our series of 5th anniversary events is off to a wonderful start. I want to share with everybody information about our next event, which will be very much on theme with this, about advancing equal partnerships for health and human rights and equity. Thank you all so much on behalf of the Institute on Inequalities in Global Health, Professor Sophia Greskin, who welcomed us today, Assistant Secretary Lois Pace, Solange Baptiste, Rajat Khosla. Thank you all so much, and everyone have a wonderful rest of your day.